So when we were looking at psychosomatic illnesses a little earlier, and essentially we were talking about phenomena that we can kind of understand. You know, I was emphasizing that we experience anxiety, it's kind of a normal physiological response to stress, that the range of anxiety symptoms are symptoms, you know, that we all have, these aches and pains and so on. But when we come to psychosis, it's very different, because we're now talking about something that is not understandable. It's often said then to be ununderstandable. And it's therefore very hard for any of us who have not experienced these horrific illnesses to kind of understand what's going on in these poor people suffering from them. We can understand without too much effort the psychosomatic illnesses and depression that I've talked about before, and even possibly dementia to some extent. But these are beyond us, beyond normal experience. So, you know, imagine that you hear your neighbours talking about your every movement. From when you get up in the morning, you hear them describing, you know, you get up and you wash your face and you get dressed and now you're going downstairs and you hear them talking about you. You would wonder, wouldn't you, how that can be, you know, what's going on? You know, how can they know? They're describing exactly what I'm doing. How can they know this? Have they got cameras, you know, spy cameras is how that will be thought of today, microphones hidden in my house, they can describe what's going on in this way? And how then can I hear them? I mean, they're not here, they're next door and so on. And of course these hallucinations, these voices, these auto hallucinations are a feature of psychosis, they're clearly abnormal, but they're very real. Or imagine believing that, being completely convinced that the people around you are your enemies, terrorists say, and you're their target. They want to kill you. They might look like, you know, the people you know and love. They might look like ordinary people, but they're not. They're part of a conspiracy to kill you and your family. And you're completely convinced of this. And you would be afraid, wouldn't you? You'd be very afraid. You'd be paranoid. These are paranoid delusions. But it's very hard, I'm saying, to get hold of this, to understand that. I'm trying to think through what that would be. But it's difficult to think your way fully into it. I think by empathizing, we can sense, yes, it would be awful if it were like that. But it's much harder. It's very, very difficult. And like I say, with anxiety and everything. Because we take it for granted that we know kind of who we are ourselves and who is not self. I am here, me, and I know my thoughts and my feelings, and I know they're distinct from you and this room and this building and so on around me. That is outside me, my ego. It's ego external, but here I am, and I know what's me and internal to my own private world. But for people with psychosis, that distinction between self and not self out there essentially seems to be broken down. So that what happens in my mind is not distinguished from what's going on out there. So my own thoughts and fears are believed to be somehow coming from outside me. They're not me, even though they are mine. Because I can't recognize that these voices must actually be generated in my head, as it were. That these beliefs about these terrorists who are pretending to be these other people and look like these other people, that these are actually my own fears generated in my head. I can't make that distinction. I think they really are out there, even though they're generated from in my mind. And this is the essence as we try to understand what's going on with psychosis. This breakdown of what we normally accept as an ability to distinguish self from not self. So when we're talking about psychosis, we normally mean what are called positive symptoms. And positive here is not, of course, meaning these are a good thing, positive in that sense. It means they're added to normal experience. There's something in addition to normal experience. So we don't normally have hallucinations and delusions, and we don't normally have the sort of disordered thought that's characteristic of some psychotic illnesses. Well, the two main ones that you hear about and I'll talk about are delusions and hallucinations. Disordered thought is also well recognized to be a feature of psychotic illness where people can't think coherently. Because of the sort of fragmentation of our minds. But that's much more difficult to identify reliably, whereas hallucinations and delusions are much more readily identifiable and therefore much more useful in identifying when somebody has a psychotic illness. But disordered thought is another feature. So with hallucinations then, we have sense perceptions. So there's sort of 5 types of sense: hearing, vision, touch, smell, and taste. And we take it, that's how we live. We interact as physical beings in the world. Those are processed through into our minds, and we experience these. So you hear me talking now, and you're aware that it's me delivering this lecture, and you hear me with your ears, and that's processed in your brain. But when you have an auditory hallucination, you hear like you're hearing me, except that there's no me sending the words to you. But it's key to recognize then that for the person with psychosis, a hallucination is as real as a normal sense perception. So hearing voices in somebody who is psychotic then is as real as you hearing anybody else. The two commonest types of hallucinations are visual, seeing things, seeing visions, and hearing voices, auditory hallucinations then. So visual hallucinations, when somebody has a visual hallucination, they see somebody as real as I'm seeing you. And they respond accordingly. They'll talk, they'll go over and try and touch this person or shake the hand or something, and of course they're not there because it's purely internally generated. But the experience is as real as if they were there. That's one of the key features. It's not, the hallucinations, delusions are not kind of shadowy or something. They're not weak. They're fully real sense-type experiences. More rarely they may be of unusual smells or tastes or bodily experiences, but the most common, as I say, are visual and auditory that we use in diagnosing psychotic illnesses. So hallucinations are to do with our senses and experiencing things through our senses, or in the case of hallucinations, they're not coming through our senses, but they're as if they were, they're that real. Delusions are to do with beliefs. So delusions are to do with beliefs, and a delusion then is a fixed false belief, and then they're qualified not in keeping with religious and cultural backgrounds. So, there are people around us in our society who believe in UFOs or believe in Martians or aliens or something, and they're completely convinced of this. There are people around us, who, in fact, I think there's been a program on at the moment about, the death of Princess Diana was some kind of plot from MI6 or something. And they're completely convinced that there was some kind of conspiracy by British authorities to kill her. The same, of course, in America with John Kennedy and his assassination. There's been long-standing conspiracy beliefs. At the moment, we've got this bizarre QAnon kind of movement in the right wing in the US, where people have this weird set of beliefs about paedophiles and so on, which, these people are convinced about them. They're strongly held beliefs. But we recognize these things are not delusions because they're cultural. We recognize that, odd though they may be, ridiculous though we may think they are nonetheless held by other people in the same sort of subculture. And so, we all have our beliefs. This is who we are. We believe things, we know things are true, we're convinced of them, etc., etc. And sometimes they're wrong. But the fact that they're wrong doesn't make them a delusion. And that's crucial, because that's the way often delusions are misused. If it's wrong, then it's a delusion. Well, it's not wrong because it's a delusion if it's understandable within a culture. And every culture is filled with people who have all sorts of odd beliefs. That doesn't make them delusions, and it doesn't mean that the individual has a mental illness. Now, of course, you can see how this gets misused, because in China today and Russia in the past and so on, some societies choose to categorize Christians, for example, as mentally ill, because we believe things like the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the existence of God who rules over the universe, that other people don't believe. If you simply say that the fact that some people disagree with you and say it's a belief that they have, but it's wrong, in my opinion, as a delusion and mental illness, then that's how you can start categorizing all sorts of normal people as having mental illness. And that's been deliberately misused in some societies like China today to lock up Christians or other people of other religious beliefs as well, for beliefs that are, cultural, if you like. So it's part of, psychiatry and the definitions of delusions. They're not cultural and religious or political beliefs. So they're strongly held and they're false. So how do we know they're false? Well, it's to do with asking about the evidence for them. So, if you ask the person who believes that, there are terrorists impersonating the people at work who are trying to kill them, well, how do you know that he is a terrorist and not who he claims to be, not who he looks like? And then they will come up with some sort of bizarre explanation that, the aliens from outer space have a special technology whereby they can reshape people and make them look just like them and substitute them for these people. And that's why they look exactly the same. And so when you probe into these delusional beliefs, what you find is the kind of opening up of what we call delusional systems, where the evidence becomes increasingly bizarre that's used to justify the delusional belief. And with schizophrenia then, it's particularly the case that they have these bizarre delusional systems whereby they try to explain the phenomena. And what you have then is an illness generating, a paranoid belief that, this person isn't who he looks like and says he is, but it's actually an imposter who's my enemy, wants to kill me. And you then have to try and work out how that can be. And so they come up with these kind of ways to try to understand what they're completely convinced of because of their illness creating a delusion. And the key thing here, when I'm talking about not being cultural, is that what we're about here is trying to diagnose illness. We're not trying to, it's not like collecting postage stamps where you say, this is a fixed false belief, therefore it's a delusion. It's about, is this belief generated because somebody's sick? Is it a feature of illness? It's not a case of just saying, I think this is a delusion, as if that's the end of it. The point of trying to understand it is to know whether the person's ill or not. So whether you agree with a belief or not is irrelevant. It's whether what's going on is generated by an illness. So with schizophrenia, you often have these sort of weird experiences, like I've been talking about, that are really difficult to relate to. With bipolar disorder and severe depression, you get what are called mood congruent delusions and hallucinations. That is, they're understandable, they're congruent illness that they have. So a person with mania believes that he has superpowers and can, lift buildings or something. And that fits with the fact that the person's, elated and cheerful and grandiose and thinks they're fantastic and everything's wonderful. So they have these kind of experiences that fit with their mood. Or the person with severe depression believes that, her bowels are disintegrating, that her heart has been removed from her body and she's dying. But you can't really understand it, but you can kind of see how it fits with their prevailing mood of depression. Whereas with schizophrenia, there isn't a mood disturbance which you can fit it into. They're just odd beliefs, these delusions and hallucinations. Now, delusions occur in other conditions, and I've got there non-bizarre in dementia. Arguably, dementia is the commonest cause of delusions and hallucinations. But we tend not to think of dementia as a psychotic illness, but you do get these psychotic phenomena well recognized in dementia and in other situations. Now, because of what I've been saying about the person being completely convinced about these experiences, then they don't recognize they're ill. They lack what we call insight. They don't have normally, when you're healthy and when you're ill. We take that for granted. We understand something about ourselves. But people with mental illness don't see that. They can't grasp that they're ill because they're completely convinced that these beliefs are true. That these hallucinations aren't hallucinations at all. They're real experiences of people talking about them, or they're real people whom they see out there, whereas in fact they're visual hallucinations. And because they lack this, it's very difficult to reason with them. You try to reason and explain, and it doesn't go anywhere. Now, that isn't to say don't try, but it is to kind of don't try too hard, don't keep up with it, because you're not going to be able to kind of explain or reason away. In fact, the inability to reason and explain away these phenomena is part of the way you recognize that they are indeed psychotic. Because you get all these weird other beliefs that try to explain the core features, the delusions and hallucinations that you can see and they tell you about. Now, what I've been talking about is so far with these delusions, hallucinations, is what we call the form of the illness. So a delusional belief can be, like I've said, that you believe there are terrorists who are imposters and look like these other beliefs. There's all sorts of delusions that you can have that occur. And the content, historically, there are all these people who claim to be, Napoleon or Julius Caesar or something. And that's because the content, who you choose to believe, or that you believe these are terrorists. Believing in terrorists, for example, or aliens, is a modern phenomenon because there didn't used to be this sort of well-recognized phenomenon of terrorism and aliens, etc. In the past, people had other delusional beliefs. So that is, the content, who you believe these people to be, differs with a culture and one's own life experience. So it doesn't matter whether you believe this person believes that, he's a terrorist, whether he believes that he's an alien, or whether I believe that, you're Napoleon or something. It's still a delusional belief, and that marks the fact that you've got a mental illness, a psychotic illness. So I can't remember if I come back to Richard Dawkins and so on. But, he's guilty of that error of, criticizing the mentally ill by misunderstanding and misrepresenting them by his desire to categorize, Christian beliefs in particular, religious beliefs in general, as delusional, the God delusion, etc. Now, of course, by definition, as you can see, because delusions are to do with illness generated and they're not cultural, religious, etc., as usual, Dawkins doesn't know what he's talking about and just wants to kind of just use language to slander those he disagrees with. And in this case, he slanders Christians or other religious beliefs by saying it's delusional, but at the same time, he's slandering the mentally ill because he's misrepresenting their experiences, which are illness-driven. They're nothing to do with a cultural belief or a religious belief. They're sick. And Dawkins is cruel in his approach. So the content of beliefs is shaped by our culture. So I've mentioned different types of psychotic illness: schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression are major psychotic illnesses that we recognize. I've touched on the fact that dementia, psychotic symptoms are common in dementia. They're common in delirium when people, particularly older people, get sick in hospital. They have hallucinations and paranoid delusional beliefs because, our mind is being damaged because we're psychosomatic wholes, and physical illnesses deranges our mind and generates, in these cases, psychosis. But in the case of delirium, at least, it normally passes off when the physical illness is treated. Again, illustrating this strong link that we know as Christians there is between our body and our mind, that the physical illness leads to these mental, even psychotic symptoms. But, various drugs, alcohol, and all sorts of illicit substances, illegal substances, can generate psychotic experiences, can usually then transient psychosis. And the psychotic illnesses that we normally talk about at the top, schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression, are long-term conditions. They're usually not one-off episodes. They are like arthritis and asthma and things. They last for many years, typically. So an important thing to be clear about, and which society consistently gets wrong, is the distinction between psychosis and psychopathy. So here's a couple of psychopaths that you may recognize. Ian Brady, the Moors murderer. And these people were wicked, they were cruel, they were sinful, they were psychopaths. They were not, as far as we can see, mentally ill. And there's a tendency to use psychosis or psychotic and psychopath as if they're interchangeable. And it happens all the time in the media and in films, TV and things. People say, ooh, he's psychotic because he's behaving in a really wicked way. They think, I can't understand how these people can behave in such a cruel way and kill these people and torture these people in this way. And people say, I can't understand this. It's psychotic. It isn't psychotic. These are very bad people. This is not mental illness. Psychosis is not psychopathy. So antisocial personality disorder is just about to not become the latest term for psychopathy. It's going to change. But anyway, so these are some of the criteria that are used for diagnosing a psychopathic personality disorder or an antisocial personality disorder. And you read them, deceitfulness, failure to conform to social norms and lawful behaviors, aggressiveness, fights, assaults, irresponsibility, lack of remorse, cruelty. These are, in many cases, criminal behaviors, but in almost all cases, sinful behaviors. And so these are people who are behaving in these bad ways, and these are psychopaths, whose behavior is in this pattern. And this is not mental illness. And historically, there's been this, distinction between the personality disorders and illness, and rightly so. Because obviously we all have personalities, and we have different patterns of personality, different personality traits that make up who we are, and we therefore have different patterns of behavior, etc., etc. And extremes are what psychiatrists will call personality disorders, particularly when they're problematic like this. But this is not the same as being ill. This is who we are and how we behave and live, and behaviors for which we're responsible. But it's possible to have both. Anybody with any personality, all of us, we can get ill in all sorts of different ways, and so people with personality disorders get ill. And people who have personality disorders, particularly psychopaths, who are also psychotic, are particularly difficult. In the film, the Oscar-winning film last year, then the Joker character is, as I understand it, portrayed in this way. And there was a review in the British Journal of Psychiatry there on the Joker film, how entertaining films may affect public attitudes towards mental illness. So apparently, in the film then, there's this individual, Arthur Fleck, who early on is shown to be, I think, psychotic. He's taking medication and things. And at the end, he's shown to be psychotic. He's returned to hospital and to take medication again. So it seems he's portrayed as somebody who is psychotic, perhaps schizophrenia. But in between, he does all sorts of, horrible things. Because he's also got a personality disorder, he's also a psychopath. And the problem, of course, this article was saying is the way, yet again, this is confusing people about what's going on. There's no clear distinction in the way the film portrays it between his illness, this character, and his behavior. And, this happens again and again, this confusion of psychosis and psychopathy between what's illness, which is psychosis, which is personality and bad behavior, which is psychopathy. Because the thing with psychopaths, and therefore by this confusion with the wrong understanding of psychosis, is people think psychotic people are dangerous. Because people with psychosis are lumped together or confused with psychopaths, and psychopaths are these people who do bad things, assaulting, hurting, cruel behaviors, killing people, kidnapping people and so on, raping people. These are psychopathic behaviors. Because people behave like that, and then they think that's psychosis, they think that people with psychosis are dangerous. And they're not. They're not. On average, psychotic people are less dangerous than anybody else. They're not dangerous. The people psychotic people are a danger to is themselves. They are the people who are most hurt and most at risk from psychosis. They don't look after themselves, they neglect themselves, they don't eat and drink properly, they don't wash and look after themselves in these basic ways. They stop taking medical treatments they need and they get more ill. They're at much higher risk of killing themselves. And because they often end up on the streets, as down and out, rough sleepers, they often are assaulted themselves because they're so vulnerable. They're at risk themselves of assault from others. Now, the individual I've got here is Ian McNeice in a TV series portraying a character, Mr. Dick, whom some of you may know from David Copperfield, so Charles Dickens' novel. And Mr. Dick is a genial, he's a clearly psychotic individual, but he's a genial chap who's popular and friendly, if you're willing to kind of go with his weird delusional beliefs and everything. But he's helpfully portrayed there because he's in no way a threat to anybody. He's much more typical and representative of real people with psychosis who are not a threat to other people. They're a threat to themselves. They're not a threat to others. They are soft, gentle, likable people, typically. The illness kind of attenuates people. But it's key then to know people with psychosis are not a risk to others. They're less of a risk than you and I to other people. Less of a risk on average, but they are a risk to themselves. Don't confuse psychosis and psychopathy. Also, don't think of schizophrenia then relatedly as split personalities. There's something you hear. Schizophrenia means split personality. Now, technically, of course, it means split mind. And that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about this failure to distinguish in your mind between self and not self. That's what's going on as we try to understand it with psychosis. The sort of splitting of the mind, so I don't know what's me and what's not me. But when we use the term split personality, it's of course used in that sort of Jekyll and Hyde way, isn't it? It's used to mean, here's a person who one day seems quite nice, Dr. Jekyll, and then the next day he's horrible and evil, like Mr. Hyde. And that changeability is thought, this is what schizophrenia is. They're very changeable people. Well, they are changeable with their illness, the psychotic symptoms and features change, but they're not changeable in that kind of way that we say, he's like one person today and he's another type of person tomorrow. That is not what's going on with schizophrenia. So schizophrenia then, Positive symptoms I've talked about, delusions, hallucinations in particular, and disordered thoughts. There's also what's typically called negative symptoms, which is supposed to be a kind of loss of aspects of personality. So people with schizophrenia are supposed to be less socially aware and engaging, more emotionally flat and unresponsive. They lack drive and energy to do things. They're supposed to be characterized as loners and not social people. Now, I think a lot of this is actually probably incorrect, because one of the difficulties here is that people with schizophrenia in particular, and psychosis in general, used to spend most of their life locked up in madhouses or asylums. And so, if you spent most of your life chained up or locked in a room, it's going to affect your behavior in these sorts of ways, isn't it? So nowadays, with people not spending those times, we don't tend to see some of these negative symptoms, and I think a lot of them are probably artifact, actually. But the positive symptoms are certainly the real ones that we use in diagnosis. But something else that is true of people with mental illnesses in general, and especially with psychosis, is the effects on their cognition, that is their memory and learning and thinking. And historically, the term dementia praecox was used, that is a kind of pre-senile or early onset of dementia. And this recognises the fact that people with schizophrenia in particular, but it's also now established with other psychosis, bipolar and depression, actually have damaged their memory and learning and everything. If you do tests, you can show that. And when people are psychotic and ill, they're very impaired with their thinking. And that's why this term dementia praecox is helpful, because it reminds you to think it isn't just the psychosis. That's horrible in itself, but there's a wide and damaging impact on people of the illness. But also then all sorts of symptoms arise in schizophrenia, so depression, obsessions, compulsions, various anxiety symptoms. Now, a lot of these are understandable once you think what's going on, although you can't fully understand the psychosis. If you believed that these people were terrorists trying to kill you and your family, then you would be anxious, wouldn't you? And you might be pretty moody and difficult. You might be depressed if you felt this was going on and nobody believed you, and so on. So a lot of the symptoms are understandable in that way, as arising from the core features of the illness. But it's probable that some of these others are generated directly from the illness as well, because it's a wide-ranging illness. You may remember I said with dementia, all these things can occur. So these illnesses that profoundly affect us with our minds, have widespread impacts on our symptoms and behaviour. Schizophrenia, how common is it? Well, it's pretty established. It's 1% of the population. It's a pretty robust figure, down for many years and around the world. So 1%, 1 in 100 of everybody in our society. It's not, whether you call that rare or not, these are long-term illnesses, and there's therefore a lot of people. I remember that's just schizophrenia, not bipolar, which is similar, about 1%, and psychotic depression, which is similar at probably about 1%. So maybe, 3% of people have these sorts of illnesses. So they are out there, and in a church of any reasonable size, there will be people who have these illnesses. They're not rare in the way I would use rare in medicine. They're common enough to be frequently encountered. So I'm not really going to say much about treatment because this is special, and as I've said before, the step care approach is what we should always be seeking to use with everybody who's mentally ill in our churches. But specifically then within medicine, then the sort of mainstays of treatment are medication with so-called antipsychotic drugs and psychological approaches to help people and families to learn to handle, to understand as best we can, a bit like I'm doing with you now, educating you about these experiences, so you can get some level of understanding of what's going on with these people, and therefore some way of kind of helping talk with them, engage with them, and support them through these horrific experiences. So there's more specific types of people who've got much more experience at doing this in a specialist way, the psychological approaches, psychotherapies, but it's that and medication with antipsychotics, the mainstays of treatment that we use in health services. So Bipolar disorder is another major psychotic mental illness. The poles then refer to the kind of pole of being very low, down with depression, and high, elated in the manic phase. And so people with bipolar move between these two poles. And by definition then, you have to have both poles to meet the diagnosis. Though a 1F episode of mania makes it almost certain the person's got bipolar. You're going to get depressed at some future point. And so mania then is characterized by this effusion of energy and drive with a great elevation, sometimes irritability, but characteristically an elated, extreme happiness, if you like. And with this great energy, then these people don't sleep very much. They hardly sleep at all in a manic episode. They have prodigious amounts of energy and therefore can do all sorts of things all day long, charging around, traveling all over the place, engaging in all sorts of activities, leaving the rest of us exhausted. They speak very, very quickly, pouring out all sorts of ideas that may be completely odd and delusional, but these sort of just pour out of them. And these episodes, when they come on, are kind of unmissable and extremely difficult, because people, when they're like this, are extremely difficult to live with, and they after a period they kind of run out of energy because they're not superhuman. They eventually run out of energy, but the manic episodes then can leave a lot of damage behind them. Because people, when they're like that, they can cause all sorts of problems to those they live with, in those they're trying to relate to, because they won't sleep, they're charging off and doing things, sometimes reckless things, damaging things. And then when they come round, as it were, and recover, they're left with this legacy of damage to relationships in their workplaces and homes and churches. And the pieces then have to be picked up afterwards. And manic episodes are not fun. People might think, oh, it'd be fun, it'd be great to be manic, to be full of all this energy and so cheerful. They're not fun. They're very damaging things to have. And again, the lifetime risk is similar to schizophrenia for having a kind of bipolar illness along these lines. And I've talked about depression last time, so when you get down to the other pole, then it's the very slowed, retarded depression. Bipolar treatment has a few more types of medication that we use to treat people, so-called mood stabilizers like lithium, antipsychotics again to try to treat then particularly the manic phase, antidepressants when they're in the depressed phase. ECT can be helpful. I mentioned that particularly for depression and psychotic depression. And then again, psychological, psychosocial treatments. Again, these are typically special treatments that you need on people, especially in these very severe phases of illness. And characteristic, of course, when people are very manic, they end up in hospital. But they'll be out again later and need help picking up the pieces. I mentioned psychotic depression when I talked on depression. Whether psychotic depression is, as I think, a different kind of illness than other depression, or whether it's a continuum, is still a matter of debate. But certainly at its extreme end, people with depression, when it's severe, become psychotic in a way that, as I mentioned earlier, it's congruent with their mood, these sort of nihilistic, horrible, negative beliefs that are delusional, fixed, unchangeable. And again, like people with bipolar when they're psychotic, like people with schizophrenia when they're psychotic, they typically end up in hospital, often detained under the Mental Health Act, that is sectioned and brought compulsorily into hospital. The mainstays of treatment are often an ECT. It's the most effective treatment, especially for psychotic depression, for which it's very effective, but also then a combination of antidepressants and, again, as you might expect, antipsychotic drugs, and again, as I mentioned before, psychological treatments. So how do we help these people? Well, the first thing is, although it's hard because the experience of psychosis are ununderstandable, ultimately, I've tried to show you if we can understand something of what's going on, we can have some level of understanding, and there's some way of trying to relate to them, and then therefore treat them as ill people like you would everybody else when they're ill. These are sick people, and so treat them like everyone else when we're ill. That's a sort of starting point. Don't be scared. They're not dangerous. And although delusional beliefs are upsetting and difficult to relate to, try to understand what it would be like to have these sorts of beliefs, and therefore empathize with the suffering they have for these beliefs, even when they refuse themselves to accept that they are ill and that these are delusional. So try not to back off, try to engage. And as I mentioned before, obviously when they're in hospital it's different, but once they're out of hospital, the step care approach that I've mentioned about helping them to have a regular pattern in their lives, a support network in the family and in the church, getting these basics of daily living right, supporting them in that, because even when they are a lot better and well, they still have symptoms that might not be so obvious. And they still have the damage there to their thinking and reasoning, and need help and support from friends and family in the church family. So the step care that I've mentioned before, these key elements that we just want to help and apply to all people with mental illness, because these things are what support people, and they're the foundations on which specialist services in the health service, what we build on. If these things aren't there, then the rest doesn't work very well. We need the support from family, friends, the church family, and that enables us in special service to build on that and optimize the outcome and the wellness of people with these horrific illnesses.